My next patron question is from Graham, who would like to know my thoughts on the type of homage. Where do you believe the line is between simply referencing another piece of media and outright stealing from it? I understand this is a tricky area, but I'm curious to know your thoughts on it. That's an interesting question, because every piece of media is inspired by something else, and the filmmakers or television show writers will often slip in something that comes from their genuine affection for that other movie or show or book. There are even movies that are outright tributes to what inspired them. Star Wars is probably the most famous example of this. George Lucas wanted to make an homage to Flash Gordon and other serials he loved in his youth. In fact, he even tried to get the rights to make a Flash Gordon movie, but found out they were owned by someone else, so he decided to make his own. As a result, the Star Wars movies are chock full of homages to those serials, like the opening text scroll and the wipe transitions between scenes. Akira Kurosawa's The Hidden Fortress is also often cited as a clear influence on Star Wars, mostly it's because of two bickering peasants resembling R2-D2 and C-3PO, and other elements later worked their way into the prequels, like the Princess Decoy. Lucas's original draft of Star Wars actually shares even more in common with The Hidden Fortress. There are other influences I can mention too, like the design of C-3PO being modeled after the robot in Fritz Lang's Metropolis, the Death Star battle borrowing from World War II fighter pilot movies like The Dam Busters, and Tatooine sharing similarities to Arrakis in Frank Herbert's Dune. There's several more, but it's a credit to George Lucas that he could package these and still make a movie that was all his own. He, like many great artists and filmmakers, was able to borrow from these and evolve and tweak the ideas to fit the world of Star Wars. Superman is often mentioned as the superhero that would inspire almost everyone that followed, but Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster borrowed a lot from others. Superman gaining powers after ending up on a different planet and being able to leap tall buildings in a single bound in the original comics was taken from Edgar Rice Burroughs' character John Carter. In fact, John Carter of Mars has been a massive influence on a lot of science fiction stories and movies. So when the film adaptation was finally released in 2012, people looked at the trailers and said it felt derivative of Star Wars and Avatar. However, it only seemed that way because Lucas, James Cameron, and most other sci-fi creators under the sun took from the original John Carter stories. Then you have comedies where they might use classic routines previously done in other comedies or by other comedians. If there's a scene where characters pretend to be a mirror image of another person, it's usually heavily borrowed from the mirror scene in Duck Soup. But it's basically just taking that bit and applying it to these specific characters, and they might occasionally throw in a twist on the concept. Abbott and Costello's famous Who's On First routine has also seen multiple variations on the idea over the years. There's a Slappy Scroll segment on Animaniacs where they make the routine about band names like The Who and the band. It's obviously paying homage to Who's On First, but still doing something different with it and specific to the Woodstock setting in that cartoon. Back to the Future takes a classic comedy scene and applies it to a dramatic moment. When Doc Brown is hanging off the clock tower, that's a reference to Harold Lloyd doing the same in Safety Last. One of Doc's clocks shown at the beginning of the movie is even one based on that scene, although you also have comedic bits which are taken verbatim without doing anything new with it. There's a scene in the movie Ted that is literally just a recreation of the same scene from Airplane. Like, what is the joke? That Seth MacFarlane has seen Airplane? It does not add anything to the scene, which was itself meant to be a parody of Saturday Night Fever. It was merely recycling a moment from a previous comedy and nothing else. Now this does go into the question of rip-offs and if something is intentionally stealing from another work. The most obvious of these are the movies associated with The Asylum, where they slightly tweak the names of well-known blockbusters, release them at around the same time, and hope somebody makes a mistake and watches their cheaply made version instead. Although sometimes they just use a similar title, and the movie itself has very little relation to the film being ripped off. There was a Canadian animated movie titled The Legend of Cirilla, which the American distributor decided to retitle Frozen Land and give it a logo suspiciously similar to a certain Disney movie. Disney then sued the company who did this for obviously trying to fool the audience. Disney won the lawsuit, and the distributor was forced to revert that movie to its original title. But sometimes, movies just have similar premises, or only have extremely minor similarities to each other. I remember when the trailer for Sing was released, people accused that movie of ripping off Zootopia, even though Zootopia did not invent the concept of a city where a variety of animals live together, which is pretty much the only thing those movies have in common. I'm also sure Richard Scarry beat both of those movies to the punch decades earlier. Unless it's extremely blatant that the filmmakers deliberately copied the other film and is mooching off its success, I find myself to not be too bothered by it, and don't tend to knock points from a movie for that. There was a Hulu movie released a few years ago about the Boston Strangler, which seemed to take a lot of obvious inspiration from David Fincher's Zodiac, even having very similar scenes. But did the filmmakers steal from it, or realize it had a strong template for how to make a movie about journalists investigating a serial killer? Although it also meant the film was not able to carve its own unique identity, in my opinion. You also have cases where the ripoff still has some artistic merit. Joe Dante's Piranha was one of several killerfish movies made after Jaws to try and capitalize off its success. Even the poster is clearly aping Jaws. However, it's still a well-done movie with a lot of creativity and decent thrills, with Steven Spielberg saying how much he loved it. Spielberg even prevented Universal from trying to stop the movie's release because they were worried about it opening around the same time as Jaws 2. It's difficult to find a movie or show or book or play that does not make reference to another one, whether the filmmakers are influenced by them or try to utilize what they did well. It all depends on what creative ideas they bring to the project and how they execute it. Thank you for your question, Graham.